Hello everyone, welcome to our Week 2 summary video for North America FACEIT Masters League. Now, in Week 1 we didn't have all that much exciting action from North America. None of the top teams really bumped into each other, and those that didn't even have their full rosters. Week 2, aka round 3 and 4, we've got a lot more action, a lot more of these top teams meeting. Still some roster problems in places, but overall I think the quality of matches we got to see this week, way up on Week 1. And now, because we're 4 rounds deep, the standings are starting to flesh out as well, so there's a lot of interest to be had. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about at all, the FACEIT Masters League is the top league in a sort of skill-based pyramid. Now, it's a FACEIT tournament where the top 16 teams from North America compete against each other. They're doing a big round robin at the moment, and there's going to be a top 8 of this round robin, so we're going to split it right in half. The top 8 teams go to a knockout tournament, and the top 3 from that will secure a spot of Esports World Cup, which is why it's quite coveted and why you see all the top teams like Toronto and M80, etc. all playing in it. So we can take a little bit of a look at the schedule that we have so far. So a very colourful spreadsheet. I'm sure we can all agree. Week 1 has happened. Not too many crazy results. The Luminosity Citrus Nation game actually was carried over to this week because of scheduling difficulties. But as you can see, we're going to see a few more matchups between Toronto and some of the top teams, FMCL and TSM. So what I'm going to try and do here is I'm going to take you through each series. We'll play some highlights, and we can talk a little bit about how each match went and what it means in terms of the bigger picture. So let's get right on into it. To kick us off is Avidity and Green Fortnite. Now, 2 teams that you're probably a little bit less familiar with. I think Green Fortnite are the team I want to highlight. They keep winning, and actually they're doing remarkably well, even though maybe on paper you wouldn't have them maybe as one of the sort of top 5 or 6 teams, but they keep getting results. Their fixtures have been relatively straightforward compared to some other teams, but the fact that they're winning the games against these teams that would be in and around them certainly has propelled them up the rankings, and I think it's actually a team to keep an eye on, and maybe over the next couple of weeks we'll get some streams going and some coverage for their games directly. Next up is T, which is TSM, aka former Timeless, against UNC Inc. Now, UNC Inc are a team who kind of just keep losing. TSM were heavy favourites in this one anyway, so no real surprises there. A couple of 0 defers from Rocket and Icy on map 1 here. Very dominant from TSM, as you'd expect, and a nice win for them. Next, we have FMCL against Shikigami. Now, FMCL, you would expect to win this. Shikigami are the team sort of competing. Can they get one of those 8th place spots? They got into the top 8, obviously, in OWCS Stage 1, but failed on in Stage 2. This time, they're against a team much stronger, and they actually get kind of dominated as well. I think, even though you'd expect FMCL to win, this was actually a very one-sided series. Then we move on to Luminosity versus Citrus Nation. So this is the round 2 game that was rescheduled in this week. Also, you have to bear in mind, because this isn't right either. It was actually a 2-0. Nishimbali didn't happen. As you can see, they just won Samoa and Icon World. And it's actually pretty one-sided here. What was most interesting is Citrus Nation, the last team playing Orisa and trying to make that work. Meanwhile, Luminosity played Dante both maps and played Doom in both maps, and as you can see, it did not go well. So a lot of problems for Luminosity, especially in this fixture. They're coming off a very busy schedule, or actually they've underperformed in multiple tournaments, and it didn't seem like they were exactly sure what to play here, and more continued bad results against Citrus Nation. So a big problem for Luminosity when we look at this series here. On the flip side for Citrus Nation, still look impressive. The problem is maybe, can Zeb really keep playing Orisa after it's been nerfed so much? The answer is yes, at least when they're playing against this Doomfist. But how will that translate as we look at more of their matches? So I think still a big question for Citrus Nation in terms of what are they actually going to play going forward out of this. Then we get Dreamland versus Valentine. And this is an important win for Dreamland, I think. These are the sort of teams where you look at how the rankings will settle at the end, and you think, well, there's certain teams where maybe like for Toronto's M80s you don't expect to beat, and some of the weaker teams you'll definitely beat, and then there's a series of games you'll play in this round robin against the teams in and around you, and these are the important ones to win, and I think Dreamland have done a pretty good job here, managing to get this result after losing the Koff, winning Hollywood, winning Shambali, and actually quite dominant results coming back. So a good win for Dreamland. Again, one of these teams maybe in the Shikigami category of, can they take one of these sort of bottom qualification spots to get into the top 8? Then a little bit more error in the FACEIT page in terms of how it's displayed. They did not actually play every single map in the game. They only played 2 maps. Green Fortnite won, so a 2-0 week for Green Fortnite, can't complain. Smart Fellas probably are one of the weakest teams in the tournament, to be fair. So again, Green Fortnite have very winnable fixtures, but they are winning them. So you can't complain. Green Fortnite will go quite high up the rankings off the back of this 2-0 week. Then we get to Valentine over Avidity. Again, Avidity are probably maybe the bottom team or one of a couple of bottom teams here. So Valentine win by actually quite a large margin here. So a useful win for him to have, but I think ultimately beating Avidity is maybe what most of the teams in this division are going to do. So not too much to read into there. Then we move on to Luminosity, who face Dreamland. And this is where we get maybe a bit in that tier break again, where we looked at, say, FMCL versus Shikigami, whereas Luminosity are probably close to the FMCL tier. Then the tier below it is maybe Shikigami and Dreamland in there. So one that Dreamland would expect to lose and one that they did lose. What's maybe interesting here is that we also got to see a bit more variety. Rather than just playing Doom, we got False on map 1 and then we got Dante back in for map 2. So False in for Nepal. Obviously they do play some Sigma on Sanctum quite commonly. And then Dante in for Icon World where there's maybe a bit more swapping and different parts of a map require different solutions. But Luminosity get back to winning ways, even if it's a game they would expect to win. Then we get on to Toronto's first fixture, and they played against Students of the Game. And on paper, you might look at this and go, "Oh, pretty close, Hollywood, huh?" It kind of was, but it wasn't. They took a Ryan mirror ultimately on Hollywood. It was a lot of fun. It was entertaining. Infected versus someone Ryan. Who's going to come out on top? Well, I guess we kind of see. But it was a lot of fun at Hollywood. I think Students of the Game not taking it too seriously. They understand that Toronto very much a tier above them still. And Toronto joining in on the fun. Honestly, really not a bad series to watch, especially not Hollywood. It's a good laugh if you just want some light entertainment rather than anything else. So Toronto keep winning. Students of the Game lose, but most teams are going to lose to Toronto in this round robin. Then we get to M80 versus Citrus Nation. Now, this is another game that ended up being pretty fun. Citrus Nation were actually without Zeb, who was one of their key players. So what we saw instead was Renaissance come in, play exclusively Reinhardt. So Citrus Nation were tweaking the comps and trying to play. And ultimately, it wasn't that close. M80 had a lot of fun on Midtown. Again, sits in the category if you want to go have some fun, go watch that VOD. You get to see a lot of Pelican Venture. You get to see some Liar Lifeweaver. You get to see a bunch of Hawk Rhine. It's actually a pretty fun Midtown as far as things go. So, worth a watch. But overall, M80 beating a team you'd expect them to beat, especially if Citrus Nation had roster issues, which they do here. Then we get Gilberts Nightmare versus Shikigami. Gilberts Nightmare you might be a little bit familiar with because it's the SK and Jake team. Obviously, mostly playing for fun, streaming them all and such. So Shikigami really probably do expect to beat this. So it end up being a dogfight. Shikigami will be happy to get this win over the line. There's a lot of games that will be unwinnable for Shikigami in this round robin, like when they play the Torontos or the FMCLs, etc. But these are the sort of games it's really important for them to win. So I think this win, very useful in their quest to finish top 8. Meanwhile, I think SK and Jake and Gilbert's Nightmare in general, the game will be measured a lot more by how much fun they had, rather than the exact result. Top 8 is too much of a stretch for them, I think, but I'm sure they had a good time. Now, this is probably the best series to watch in terms of competitiveness and back and forth, I think, from the week in North America. It was FMCL against TSM, and this is really a battle for these teams below the sort of Toronto M80 tier in terms of how do these teams filter out while we play in this round robin. We saw a particularly impressive Nepal. I think Seeker was absolutely dominant on this map and a really good start for FMCL. Once we got over to Parisio and Route 66, we maybe started to see some of the problems FMCL had. It started to feel like especially Parisio attack on first point. FMCL had no good solution for how to do this rotation or how to get their comp in. Obviously, again, it's a dive map, which puts Ariel in a bit of a pickle, as he doesn't really want to play Winston, even though he tried it in parts of this. But it ended up being a pretty one-sided Parisio for TSM ultimately. Then when we went on to Route 66, it actually ended up being quite dominant for TSM again. We hit the same problem for FMCL once they got to a certain part of the map, and this time second attack on Route 66. It just didn't feel like they had a good way to solve that problem. They had no way to get themselves in or give themselves a favourable position, and they kind of just got stuck in the same spot for a very long period of time. As such, TSM ended up actually winning both these final maps, coming back quite strongly. I think One thing that's worth noting is CJ actually looked like the main man on these last two maps. Like every nade on Parisio, every kill was getting so much window value on Route 66. A person who's come in from maybe a surprising amount of criticism from the East lately. Actually, I think putting a player of the match performance here, a bit of redemption for him, and very much helped his team in what could turn out to be quite a crucial game in terms of sort of seeding in this top 8. Then we get Toronto Defiant versus Luminosity, and again, you might not be surprised to hear that it's a North American video, it's a North American match. Toronto have beaten another North American team. Breaking news. But actually, I was watching this from Luminosity, and there was lots of promise here compared to some of the previous series in Luminosity I watched, where there was a big level of concern of, it doesn't feel like they're particularly good on this comp, doesn't feel like they know what comp they do want to play, none of the stuff they're trying to work in. And this time, it actually felt like a lot of the stuff they did worked. Their soul for how they took Midtown first attack, they had to do it a couple of times because some things went wrong. But a couple of really smart solves, understanding of how their comp works and how they can push different areas. So I think there were some really promising aspects for Luminosity in a lot of these maps, but also some really big problems where they would just lose 5v4s or random fights or stuff like this. So some good things that maybe give me hope that Luminosity will continue to be a functional team. But a lot of problems that will need solving as well. What's maybe worth noting as well is False actually played both of these maps and looked relatively solid in both of them as well. So hopefully, between this and the Dreamland win, Luminosity are actually trending a little bit more to maybe closer to what we saw as their peak, maybe at points in Stage 1 and such. Then we get to UNC Inc. versus Pip. Now, UNC Inc. lose again, Pip come out on top. This very much sits in the category for Pip, a team who had a really disappointing, I think, finish in Stage 2 of OWCS. Redemption here, they have to go all 3 maps, but it starts to look a lot better for them as well. And we'll see their next map in a little bit as well, where they also claim a win. So even though teams they would expect to be in terms of UNC Inc, and we can take a look at our next match now, but smart fellas as well, matches they would expect to win. Again, this one included a draw, so it was a bit of a nail biter. So potentially closer than you would want it to be if you're Pip. But the important thing is you beat the teams you were meant to beat. You get yourself over the line. And obviously now between this week and next week, we're going into a new patch. So again, might be a little bit more kind to Pip. Again, Zolik playing a lot of these matches with Maple leaving to join TSM. So wins that you would expect them to get, but they got it. They got it over the line. Then we get onto the Citrus Nation Students of the Game match, which should in theory have been one of the closer ones, but actually Citrus Nation had more issues with availability and weren't able to play this one, so had to just forfeit the match. So an interesting series on paper, but Citrus Nation again hampered by roster availability and who's around, and literally not enough people around to play in this time, so Students of the Game will get the free win there in what actually should have been a very close and a very competitive game. Then the last match for the week will be Gilberts Nightmare versus M80. Now, M80 won, as you would expect. It was 2-1. Didn't get a chance to watch this one live or see the replays. From what I understand, troll comps the entire way, and maybe from 80, a little bit too much trolling on Midtown, a little bit too much trolling. Let Gilberts Nightmare take a map off them. Won't change anything in the grand scheme of things, but again, I think a lot of fun was had by Gilbert's Nightmare. Pretty happy to take a map off M80, and M80 stay on top, but probably have to do a little bit less trolling when they play against Toronto next week. We can take a look at the standings then now, because I'm recording this video actually in week 3 essentially, so during round 5. Toronto have actually got a default victory in this next week, which is why they're on 5 instead of 4, why they're ahead of everyone. But in general, we still have 3 unbeaten teams in the form of Toronto, TSM, and M80. We see a couple of teams like Pip and Green Fortnite actually very high up in these rankings compared to what we'd expect. But again, we have to look a little bit at strength of schedule so far. They've had more favourable fixtures. They've done well to win them and get off to a winning start, but they're going to start running into more difficult fixtures as we get later into the later rounds, which will probably see them balance out maybe somewhere in this sort of like 6th to 8th kind of category. Likewise, the group of teams that are 2 and 2 below them, you have to feel Luminosity, Citrus Nation, and Students of the Game especially are all going to make their way up in this chart. You'd like to hope at least, especially for Citrus Nation if they can solve some of their availability and roster issues. Luminosity had definitely a better finish to the week than a start to the week. And students of the game haven't actually been all that tested because they had for one series against Toronto, that was really hard, then they got the default win. So students of the game, Citrus Nation and Luminosity, I think, are all in a situation where they've played a lot of the tougher teams already and should get some more favourable fixtures to help them move up the table so far. And below that, it's maybe starting to become apparent that these teams are maybe very much are the bottom. Smartfellas, Avidity, Gilberts Nightmare, UNC Inc, maybe even Valentine can fall in this category of these teams might not be making too much of an impact here, and it's just going to be important for some of the other teams like the Shikigamis, your Dreamlands, your Pips, your Green Fortnites, to make sure you don't drop any maps in these 5 teams to keep yourself in that race for top 8. So we're starting to see everything take a little bit of form, and we can take a look ahead at the week 3 schedule. Now, week 3 is actually a 3-game week. Most of them are two-game weeks, but it says all 3 rounds, and as such, it means we've actually got a load of interesting fixtures on the cards for North America. Maybe the headline one that everyone is hoping for is Toronto versus M80. These, the 2 top teams, they traded series in OWCS Stage 2 playoffs, and we get to go head-to-head again here. Likewise, there'll be a lot of other interesting fixtures, I think, for Pip as well. While we saw them get back to winning ways in week 2, their standard of opposition was definitely lower. Now Pip take on FMCL, they take on TSM, and they take on Shikigami. All stronger teams, especially obviously FMCL and TSM. This, I think, will give us a much better idea of how strong Pip really are right now. So I think those are all important series to watch. Likewise, Toronto versus Citrus Nation could be interesting. Can Citrus cause any kind of major upset? We don't know. Maybe the biggest question for Citrus initially is, can they field a normal starting roster? Can they have all 5 players they want to be there? And that would be a great start for Citrus. Other than that, again, quite a few one-sided games mixed in here, but I think overall, actually, a good week of action between the Toronto M80 game and then just following Pip's progress. There's maybe some good tests in here for Green Fortnite as well, similar to Pip. Can they take on TSM? Can they take on FMCL? Can they even get a result there, if anything? So a lot to pay attention to. We're going to be covering a lot of it on this channel. Hopefully you saw all the VOD links as we went along. You can catch any of the replays I've done. We're also going to be doing a lot of them live on Twitch itself as well. So if you want to catch any of those games live, you can watch there. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see everyone next week.